Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, honestly deeply complex era of history. We're looking at the massive demographic and cultural shifts that completely reshaped the Northwest and the Pacific Coast back in the 1800s. We're going to look at the pressures, the migrations, and the tragedies that absolutely transformed both the landscape and the people living there. Okay, let's dive into this.
So think about this. If you and your neighbor both wanted to own the exact same piece of nearby land, how would you claim it before they did? It sounds like a simple question, right? But imagine playing that exact game on a continental scale. That was the literal challenge Britain faced in the mid-1800s. They were desperately trying to figure out how to claim the vast, resource-rich land in the Northwest and the Pacific Coast before the United States could snatch it up. And this single piece of geopolitical anxiety, it set the stage for everything we're about to cover.
To understand how this region was irrevocably altered, here are the 5 cascading dominoes we'll be looking at. 1. The early population. 2. Red River settlement shifts. 3. The 1862 smallpox epidemic. 4. The gold rush boom. And finally, 5. The impact on First Nations.
All right, Section 1. The early population, the status quo.
Now, before the massive migrations and all those political maneuvers of the late 19th century kicked in, the baseline population looked radically different than you might expect. By 1857, the Hudson's Bay Company estimated there were roughly 140,000 First Nations people living in the region, compared to just 10,000 people of European descent and Métis. Think about that for a second. That is a staggering 140-to-1 ratio. It really challenges a lot of the modern assumptions we might hold. The European presence back then was actually incredibly small, mostly just hovering around isolated fur trading posts.
Moving on to Section 2, Red River settlement shifts, cultural disruption.
Well, as you can probably guess, that early status quo didn't last long at all. Our first major shift happens over in Rupert's Land, specifically at the Red River settlement. Now, initially, this was a really unified, multicultural community. Just take a look at this incredible photo from 1872 showing a group of Métis traders. The Métis, who were descendants of French and British traders and First Nations women, they had this highly adaptable seasonal way of life. Farming in the summer, hunting and trapping in the autumn, working as merchants through the winter. And because of this flexibility, they acted as crucial bridges between First Nations and European cultures, fostering a really unique and functional society there at Red River.
But then comes the inciting incident for disruption in the late 1850s. Back in the East, fertile land was getting incredibly scarce. People needed space. So, looking for opportunity, a huge wave of new settlers, mostly English and Scottish, started pouring into Red River from Canada West, and they brought a completely different vision with them. They wanted to create a European, Protestant Rupert's Land, which, directly threatened the cultural balance that was already established there.
And you can literally feel the impact of this shift when you dive into the historical record. Take this quote from Louis Goulet. He was a Métis trader who actually lived through this transition. He basically noted that the old unity and friendship were vanishing, saying something was missing in the Red River colony. He observed that newcomers, especially from Canada West, were eagerly sowing racial and religious conflict, banding together to fan the flames of discord. So the community was rapidly fracturing.
Section 3. The 1862 smallpox epidemic, a devastating crisis.
So while all that cultural friction was reshaping the interior, a much more sudden, much more deadly crisis was hitting the coast. In 1862, a single infected steamship passenger from San Francisco stopped overnight at Fort Victoria and unleashed an absolute nightmare. The timeline here is just chilling. March 1862, smallpox hits Fort Victoria. Over the next 18 months, the epidemic spreads like wildfire. By the end of it, an estimated 32,000 people were dead out of a total population of 50,000. And almost all of those lost were First Nations people. Because they lacked any previous exposure to the disease, they had absolutely no immunity. The losses were catastrophic. Entire communities just disappeared completely from the map.
And this brilliantly illustrates how historians have to use different perspectives to really understand the past. On one side, we have an 1862 editorial from the Daily British Colonist. It demands First Nations be pushed out of town, literally blaming their filthy habits for spreading the disease. But then, on the other side, we have an oral history from Henry Solomon. He recounts how white merchants actually sold infected blankets from smallpox victims directly to First Nations people, who then unknowingly carried the sickness back to their camps. Looking at both of these neutrally, you really see a landscape that was deeply fractured by fear, prejudice, and overwhelming tragedy.
That brings us to Section 4, the gold rush boom, the catalyst for change.
Right around this exact same period of profound vulnerability, the whole region was hit by a massive economic shockwave, the gold rush. In 1858, gold was discovered in New Caledonia, Governor James Douglas, terrified of an American takeover, rushed to declare it the British colony of British Columbia. So the absolute crucial point to take away here is this number, 30,000. In practically a blink of an eye, just a matter of months, the non-Aboriginal population exploded from a few hundred to at least 30,000. The region was completely and totally overwhelmed.
You can really get a sense of the sheer chaos from this illustration right here. It was published in 1860, and it's called Ho for Fraser River. Prospectors were just pouring off ships arriving from eastern British North America, the US, Europe, and China. Picture a sleepy little trading post suddenly morphing into the ultimate 1800s pop-up city. It was just a mad dash for wealth that instantly transformed the landscape into these booming, chaotic hubs.
But, this rush also brought incredible diversity to the new colony. It wasn't just British and French immigrants. We're talking about people from all over the globe. Jewish merchants like David Oppenheimer became highly successful and even entered local politics. Governor Douglas even used government funds to help bring in Black Americans who were fleeing slavery down in the U.S., and many of them ended up becoming prominent local business owners.
These side-by-side images really capture the wild energy of the era. Over on the left, you've got a rapidly expanding Victoria Harbor in 1860, just totally choked with ships and new construction. And on the right, you see a formally organized military company of Black American volunteers. It perfectly shows a newly formed, highly diverse society scrambling to establish order and community in what was still a pretty wild frontier.
Of course, booms are pretty much always followed by busts. By the 1860s, the easy gold was tapped out. And when the U.S. ended the Reciprocity Treaty in 1865, slopping heavy taxes on goods from British Columbia, the local economy just tanked. Desperate business owners started hunting for cheap labor just to survive, and they found it in thousands of now unemployed Chinese prospectors. But this economic anxiety sparked intense xenophobia. Many white workers felt Chinese laborers were stealing their jobs, and that led to severe discrimination that really fractured the incredible diversity we saw during the initial rush.
All right, Section 5. Impact on First Nations, Resolution and Fallout. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final and honestly perhaps most significant consequence of this whole era, the lasting impact all of this had on First Nations territories. Because the sudden arrival of 30,000 miners, that wasn't just a logistical headache, it was a devastating intrusion. Miners were trespassing on traditional territories, completely disrupting daily life and severely polluting vital fishing waters. Eventually, those tensions boiled over into violent conflicts, most notably the Fraser Canyon War in 1858. Realizing the very real danger of an all-out war, Governor Douglas instructed his agents to start making deals to create reserves and protect First Nations land.
However, those deals Douglas made? Yeah, they were far from ironclad. Read this 1875 quote from I.W. Powell, who was the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He clearly points out that Douglas never established a firm basis of acreage for the reserves. He left the size entirely optional. And while that might have felt flexible at the time, this extreme vagueness created massive loopholes that the government would go on to exploit in future territorial disputes.
Which brings us to the tragic final domino. Once Governor Douglas's term ended, the political winds shifted entirely. The new colonial government stepped in and just ceased the treaty-making process completely. They systematically took over First Nations territories and offered absolutely zero compensation for the land. Those earlier promises of protection, they evaporated almost overnight.
And that leaves us with this vital question, taken directly from our sources. What were the long-term effects of the gold rush on the Pacific Coast region? We've seen how this frantic quest for wealth and land displaced entire populations, sparked intense cultural friction, and forever altered the geopolitical map. So how do the echoes of these 1800s demographic shifts, land policies, and cultural clashes still resonate in the Pacific Northwest today? It's an incredibly complex legacy, and one that is absolutely worth your continued exploration. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.